The silence in that house seemed heavier every time Renato closed the door to travel. It was strange how a simple sound, the click of the lock, the scraping of the suitcase down the hallway, the car engine disappearing down the street, could transform an entire house into an empty place. In the early years of our marriage, I could still cope with it. I told myself it was part of adult life, of work, of responsibilities. But over time, his absence stopped seeming temporary. It became routine. I remember that Tuesday clearly. The sky was gray from early morning, and a fine drizzle trickled down the kitchen windows as I finished putting away the breakfast dishes. Renato had left before 6, as he always did. He didn't even have breakfast with me. He just kissed my forehead quickly and said, "I'll be back Sunday, okay?" Sunday. It seemed so far away. After he left, silence took over everything. It wasn't just the lack of noise. It was that feeling that the house had lost its life. I wandered through the rooms trying to distract myself, turning on the television, putting on soft music, fiddling with my phone without really paying attention to anything. But the emptiness remained, following me from room to room. It was during this period that Max began to occupy a different space in my life. Max was our golden Labrador, already 5 years old. Calm, affectionate, and absurdly sensitive to my mood. Every time I sat on the sofa with that lost look, he would slowly appear, rest his head on my legs, and stay there in silence, as if he knew exactly when I needed company. That afternoon, I sat on the living room floor leaning against the sofa, holding a cup of already cold coffee in my hands. Max came to me immediately. His brown eyes observed me with almost human attention. "I think it's just the two of us again, right?" I murmured, stroking his head. He wagged his tail slowly. It may seem like an exaggeration to someone who has never spent so much time alone. But there are silences that begin to hurt. The more days passed, the more I felt like I was disappearing within my own routine. Renato would call sometimes, asking if everything was all right, talking about meetings, clients, delayed flights. I would automatically answer, "Everything's fine here." But it wasn't. The nights were the worst. The bed seemed too big, too cold. I slept with the television on just to hear some human voice echoing through the house. And almost always, before going to sleep, Max would appear at the bedroom door and lie down near the bed, as if silently saying, "You're not completely alone." Perhaps that's when everything started to change inside me. Because when loneliness lasts too long, even small gestures begin to mean a lot. As the weeks went by, I began to realize that my routine revolved around small things that prevented me from sinking completely into that emptiness. And, in most of them, Max was present. Every morning, even before the alarm clock rang, I felt his cold nose lightly touch my hand. It was almost a ritual. I would open my eyes, still sleepy, and there he was, sitting beside the bed, wagging his tail slowly as if to say, "Come on, get up. The day goes on." At first, those morning walks were just an obligation. But they ended up becoming the only time of day when my mind truly slowed down. The neighborhood was still quiet at that hour. The damp streets of the early morning, the smell of coffee coming from the bakeries opening early, some neighbors jogging in the square. Everything seemed lighter when Max walked beside me. He had a curious way of perceiving my emotions. On the days I was quieter, he slowed his pace. On the days I cried secretly in the bathroom before leaving, he stayed glued to me for the rest of the morning. Sometimes, it seemed like he understood me better than anyone else. And perhaps that was exactly what was starting to scare me. Renato remained distant, even when he called. Our conversations had become automatic. "How was your day?" "Normal." "And work?" "Busy." "I miss you." "Me too." But that longing no longer had the same warmth as before. It seemed like a word repeated so many times that it had lost its meaning. Meanwhile, Max was still there in every detail of my life. Waiting near the kitchen door while I prepared dinner. Lying at my feet when I watched television. Running excitedly every time I picked up his leash. On a rainy Friday, after a particularly difficult day, I sat on the sofa holding a glass of wine while the rain beat against the windows. The house was dark, illuminated only by the dim light of the television. Max jumped beside me and rested his head in my lap. Without realizing it, I started talking to him. Do you think people can feel lonely even when they're married? He just looked at me in silence. And in some strange way, that silence seemed more sincere than any answer I had received in recent months. I slowly ran my fingers through his golden fur as a tightness grew inside my chest. It wasn't just sadness. It was the feeling of being emotionally forgotten. It was as if I had become just a part of someone's routine. Max let out a low sigh and closed his eyes, peaceful, as if my presence alone was enough for him. I wanted to feel that too. I wanted to feel that my presence still mattered to someone in that simple and true way. That night, as I turned off the lights in the house and walked towards the bedroom, Max followed me as he always did. And for the first time in a long time, the silence didn't seem so frightening. Because, even without saying a single word, he continued to stay. The early mornings began to become dangerous for me. During the day, I could still distract myself with simple tasks, doing laundry, answering messages, organizing the house, walking with Max around the neighborhood. But when night came and everything fell silent, it was as if my thoughts finally found space to scream. That week, Renato had already been away for almost 10 days. His messages became shorter, more spaced out. Meeting until late. I just got to the hotel. I'll call you later. And I always replied the same way, okay, good night. But everything wasn't okay. That morning, I was sitting on the balcony floor with a blanket over my shoulders and a mug of already cold tea in my hands. The wind gently swayed the plants while the city slept silently outside. Max was lying beside me, completely at peace, as if that small moment was enough for him. I looked at the dark sky for a few seconds before speaking softly. Have you ever felt alone even while sharing your life with someone? Max slowly raised his head and observed me. It was strange how naturally I had started talking to him. Without thinking. Without shame. As if, somehow, keeping everything inside was becoming too heavy. I don't even remember the last time Renato and I really talked. I continued, feeling my throat tighten. Not about bills or trips. I mean really talking. Silence answered first. Then came that attentive, calm gaze of his, fixed on me. And that affected me more than it should have. I wiped my eyes, trying to hide the tears that were beginning to well up, but it was too late. One of them rolled down my face before I could stop it. Funny, isn't it? I let out a weak laugh. I spend all day pretending I'm strong. But as soon as the house is quiet, I fall apart. Max moved a little closer and rested his snout on my leg. It was a simple gesture. Small, even. But in that instant, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, comfort. Perhaps it's difficult to explain to someone who has never experienced emotional loneliness. Because it's not the lack of people around. It's the feeling of no longer being able to reach someone. As if there were an invisible wall between you and the person who should be by your side. And little by little, I realized that I was trying to fill that void in small routines with Max. In walks. In shared silences. In the early mornings when he stayed there without leaving. That started to scare me. Because I knew it wasn't normal to depend so much on that presence to feel good. That night, I sat there on the balcony for hours, talking about things I'd never dared to say out loud. My fears. My constant feeling of abandonment. How much I missed the woman I was before I got used to Renato's absence. And Max just stayed there. No judgment. No distractions. No hurry to leave. When I finally went into the room, it was already past 2 in the morning. I lay down on the bed trying to organize my thoughts, but my heart remained restless. Max settled near the door, as he always did. I looked at him in the dark for a few seconds. And for the first time, an uncomfortable question crossed my mind. Was I starting to cling too much to the only presence that never failed me? The change didn't happen all at once. It wasn't a big dramatic moment like in the movies. It was slow, silent. Almost imperceptible. And perhaps that's exactly what made it all the more frightening. That week, I could barely hide my emotional exhaustion. I slept poorly, woke up without energy, and spent hours staring at my phone waiting for a message from Renato that almost never came. When it did, it was quick, cold, practical. Good night. Meeting early tomorrow. Sorry for the rush. I reread those messages trying to find in them some sign of the man I fell in love with years ago. But it seemed that everything between us had been reduced to automatic habits. On Friday night, the feeling of emptiness became unbearable. I had spent the whole day trying to occupy myself, but nothing worked. I turned on the television without paying attention, let food get cold on my plate, walked around the house like someone looking for something lost without even knowing what. Until I simply collapsed. I sat on the kitchen floor and began to cry in a way I hadn't cried in years. It wasn't ordinary sadness. It was as if everything I had been holding on to for so long had finally found a way out. And Max appeared almost immediately. He came slowly, approached silently, and leaned his body against mine while I tried to catch my breath. I wrapped my arms around him almost impulsively, burying my face in his golden fur as the tears continued to fall. I don't know what's happening to me anymore, I whispered between sobs. Max remained still, there with me. In that instant, something inside me broke. Because for the first time I realized how much I depended on his presence to feel emotionally safe. How much I longed for the sound of his paws walking around the house. How much less empty the days seemed when he was near. And that brought guilt. So much guilt. I slowly pulled my face away and looked at him in silence. My heart was racing, not from fear, but from the painful awareness of something I had been trying to ignore. That night, I realized I no longer knew how to differentiate between neediness and affection. The phrase echoed in my mind like a warning. I slowly got up and went to the sink to wash my face, trying to regain control. My reflection in the mirror looked tired, distant. There were deep dark circles under my eyes and a sadness difficult to hide. For a few seconds, I wondered when exactly my marriage had started to disappear like that. Perhaps it wasn't anyone's fault specifically. Maybe relationships don't end only with fights or betrayals. Sometimes they end in silence, in routine, in lack of presence, in feelings ignored for too long. And the worst part was realizing that I had changed too. I had become so accustomed to being left alone that I started looking for comfort where it still existed, even if it confused me emotionally. Later, already lying in bed, I heard the rain begin outside. The room was dark, illuminated only by distant lightning flashing through the window. Max was lying near the bed as always. But that night, looking at him didn't seem so simple anymore. Because for the first time I realized that that bond had ceased to be just companionship. And admitting that to myself was much harder than I expected. The storm began shortly after 10 o'clock at night. The wind lashed against the living room windows, and the thunder seemed to shake the whole house. Normally, I liked rain. I always found the sound of it falling on the roof comforting. But that night, everything seemed different. Heavier. Darker. Maybe because I felt the same way inside. I turned off the living room lights and sat on the sofa watching the lightning illuminate the yard for a few seconds before everything went back to darkness. Max was lying near my feet, quiet, but attentive to my every move. I picked up my phone again. No message from Renato. Not a call. Not even a good night. Just silence. I put the device down beside me and closed my eyes for a few seconds, trying to ignore the growing tightness in my chest. But it was useless. The more I tried to push my thoughts away, the more they came back. Memories began to surface without warning. Renato and I laughing together in the kitchen of our first apartment. The impromptu trips at the beginning of our relationship. The late nights we spent hours talking about the future. The plans. The promises. The feeling of being loved. Where had it all gone? While the rain fell outside, I tried to understand why my heart was so empty. I felt my eyes burning again. Sometimes I think the worst part of losing someone isn't when they leave. It's when they're still there, but emotionally they can no longer reach you. I looked around the room and realized how quiet that house had become for someone who was still married. Max slowly got up and came to the sofa. Without hesitation, he rested his head in my lap. I ran my fingers through his soft fur almost automatically while trying to control my tears. I miss him. I murmured softly. But I think I miss who we were more. That sentence destroyed me inside the instant it left my mouth. Because it was true. I still loved Renato. Or at least I wanted to believe I did. But there was a huge difference between loving someone and continuing to feel loved by that person. And it had been a long time since I felt like that. The rain intensified even more, filling every space in the house with that constant, melancholic sound. Max remained there, motionless, as if he knew I was about to crumble again. I lay down slowly on the sofa, hugging a pillow to my chest while he stayed by my side. And then I realized something that deeply frightened me. His presence was already the only thing that made that house feel like a home. I closed my eyes immediately, trying to push that thought away before it took root inside me. But it was too late. Because my heart had begun to associate comfort, security, and warmth with the only constant presence that never abandoned me. And that made me feel lost. The lightning illuminated the room again for a few seconds. Max lifted his head and looked at me silently, his brown eyes reflecting the weak light of the storm. At that moment, I felt a lump in my throat. What's happening to me? I whispered. He just stayed there. No demands. No questions. No making me feel inadequate. Maybe that was exactly what hurt the most. Because, deep down, I was beginning to realize that it wasn't just Renato's absence that was destroying me. It was the feeling of having spent so much time emotionally alone, that now any gesture of presence seemed too much for my tired heart. The morning after the storm, I woke up feeling strange. It wasn't just sadness. It was emotional exhaustion. As if my body had spent the whole night trying to carry an invisible weight. The house was silent again, and for a few seconds I stared at the ceiling, unwilling to get up. Max was already sitting near the bed. When he realized I was awake, he wagged his tail slowly and approached, touching his snout to my hand. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to find the strength to start another day like any other. But that day, something inside me was already nearing its breaking point. I spent the entire morning restless. I tried to work on the computer, answer emails, organize some things around the house. But my mind wouldn't stop. The silence seemed to tighten around my chest more and more. It was near the beginning of the afternoon that it happened. I was in the kitchen making coffee when I suddenly felt short of breath. The cup slipped from my hand and fell to the floor, scattering coffee and shards of porcelain across the tiles. My heart began to race uncontrollably. My hands trembled. My breathing became short, rapid, desperate. I tried to gasp for air, but it seemed impossible. The world around me faded. I could only think, I can't take it anymore. I slowly slid to the kitchen floor as panic took hold of me. It had been years since I'd had a crisis like that. Maybe because I'd been pretending to be okay for years. And then I felt Max beside me. He appeared running, restless, pressing his body against mine as I tried to catch my breath. His paws lightly scratched the floor, and he made small, distressed sounds as if trying to call me back to reality. I instinctively held his fur. Calm down. Calm down. I repeated to myself, no longer knowing if I was talking to myself or to him. Gradually, I began to focus on his breathing. Slow, steady, present. While everything inside me seemed to crumble, Max remained there. Without leaving. Without moving away. Without leaving me alone in that horrible moment. And it was exactly there, sitting on the kitchen floor amidst tears and broken shards, that something finally made sense within me. The problem was never just Renato's absence. It was the emotional abandonment I had accepted for too long. I had spent years trying to be understanding, mature, patient. Repeating to myself that work came first, that relationships changed over time, that routine was normal. But deep down, I was disappearing. And no one seemed to notice. No one except that dog who stayed by my side even in my worst moments. The tears returned with force, but this time there was something different about them. It wasn't just sadness. It was clarity. I slowly ran my hand over my face while Max remained leaning against me. It was in that instant that I understood, I needed to save myself. I couldn't continue living just waiting for emotional crumbs. I couldn't continue pretending to be happy while my heart begged for presence, attention, and care. Perhaps that crisis had been rock bottom. But it was also the first moment in a long time that I managed to see my own pain without trying to hide it. I looked at Max and smiled through my tears. "Thank you for staying," I whispered. He just wagged his tail slowly. And, for the first time in many months, I felt I needed to stop fighting to keep a marriage together alone. Renato returned home 2 days later. I heard the car pulling into the garage in the early evening while I sat on the sofa with Max lying at my feet. My heart raced immediately, but not in the way it used to. It wasn't happy anxiety. It was something else. Maybe fear. Maybe exhaustion. Perhaps it was the realization that I could no longer pretend everything was all right. The door opened, and Renato entered, dragging his suitcase down the hallway as he always did. The scent of his cologne was still familiar. For a few seconds, I just watched this man who once knew every version of me. Now he seemed like a stranger crossing my house. "Hi," he said, dropping his suitcase near the wall. "Hi." Max ran to him, wagging his tail, happy to see him. Renato quickly petted him on the head before looking at me again. "Are you okay?" It was a simple question, but perhaps it had come too late. I took a deep breath before answering, "I don't think so." The silence that followed was heavy. Renato frowned slightly, as if he hadn't expected to hear that. Maybe because I had spent so much time saying everything's fine, that he actually believed it. Or maybe because it was easier to believe that. He sat in the armchair opposite the sofa and watched me for a few seconds. What happened? I could have avoided that conversation again. I could have swallowed it all, like I always did. But after the crisis I had, something inside me changed. I was tired of disappearing in silence. I looked at my own hands before speaking. "Do you know what the worst part of loneliness is?" He remained quiet. "It's not being alone. It's feeling like nobody notices you're sinking." I saw his gaze change in that instant. Maybe guilt. Maybe surprise. Maybe just shock at finally hearing me being honest. The words started to come out before I could control them. I told him about the empty nights. About the dinners alone. About the silence of the house. About how much I missed him even when he was still my husband. And, for the first time in years, Renato didn't try to interrupt. He just listened. Tears started streaming down my face again when I said the phrase that had been stuck inside me for months. It wasn't about physical absence. It was about me ceasing to exist within that relationship.